Remember the twisted games in Squid Game? What if I told you something eerily similar happened in real life? Welcome to the nightmare of Brothers Home in South Korea. Survivors described sadistic torture games just as disturbing. One was the red pepper powder game, where victims were forced to eat or inhale red pepper until they couldn't breathe. Then there was the human chair game. Guards sat on victims, and if they collapsed, they were beaten brutally. But this was no fictional game. It was real life, hidden behind the facade of a welfare center. Thousands were trapped, forced into brutal labor, while the corrupt management profited off government funds. Just like Squid Game, the ones in power thrived while innocent people suffered. And the survivors? They're still fighting for justice. Brothers Home wasn't just a welfare center, it was a living nightmare. Residents were tortured, malnourished, and forced into brutal labor. Escape? Impossible. The walls stood 30 feet high, topped with glass shards. If caught, escapees were dragged back, beaten over 100 times, and humiliated in front of thousands in a church-like setting. The church wasn't a place for prayer, it was a punishment zone. The pastor would declare, "In the name of Jesus, you're being punished," and then beat victims to the ground with boxing gloves. Families were torn apart. One father was forced into the facility and starved himself to give his son an extra bite of food. A young girl lost her sanity from the abuse and was sent to a psych ward. And all of this? Funded by the government, profiting off suffering. This isn't just a tragedy of the past. It reflects systemic exploitation happening globally. In the 1970s and 1980s, as South Korea rapidly industrialized, the government aimed to present a polished image for the 1988 Seoul Olympics. To do this, they initiated a social purification campaign, forcibly removing homeless people, vagrants, and street children from public view. Thousands were placed in government-funded facilities like Brothers Home in Busan, which were supposed to offer care. But instead, many became sites of severe human rights abuses. This dark chapter reminds us of the dangers of prioritizing national image over the rights and dignity of the most vulnerable members of society. In the 1970s and 1980s, South Korea's Brothers Home, a supposed welfare facility, became a nightmare for thousands of vulnerable individuals, the homeless, orphans, and disabled, who were forcibly detained and mistreated. But here's the chilling part. While the authorities claimed they were helping these people, the truth was far darker. Many of the residents died under brutal conditions, from forced labor, abuse, and neglect. But here's the shocking detail. The bodies weren't just disposed of quietly. Some were sold off for medical studies. That's right. Their bodies, barely broken down, were sent to universities for experiments, a dark practice that mirrors the disturbing events in Squid Game, where people are treated as expendable. In Squid Game, the players are thrown into deadly games, their lives considered worthless by those pulling the strings. It's not just fiction. The Brothers Home tragedy shows how vulnerable lives were commodified in a similar way, stripped of dignity and discarded. Over 500 people are believed to have died there, though the real number could be much higher. The truth was buried, and families were kept in the dark, never knowing what happened to their loved ones. This horror shows us the dangers of treating human lives as tools for progress, whether it's in the real world or in a fictional show. Brothers Home reminds us that behind every system, we must never forget the value of human dignity. Let's never let this happen again. While Squid Game isn't based on the Brothers Home tragedy, the similarities are deeply unsettling. Both reveal how the vulnerable are exploited and discarded for the entertainment or gain of the powerful. In Brothers Home, victims faced horrific abuse, forced labor, and in some cases, the bodies, which were not disfigured, were even sold for medical experiments and organ harvesting. A grim parallel to the fate of Squid Game players. But here's where it gets even darker. In Squid Game Season 2, there's a theory that we, the audience, are the real VIPs. With no wealthy clients shown, it suggests that by watching, we become complicit, entertained by suffering just as the VIPs were. What's even more chilling is that in real life, the family behind Brothers Home never truly faced justice. The owner, Lee Jong-rak, served a 4-year prison sentence and later died a peaceful death. But his wife and children, they're reportedly still living lives of luxury, untouched by the horror they profited from. Meanwhile, many of the victims are permanently disabled and institutionalized in mental hospitals, still haunted by the unimaginable abuse they endured. Squid Game holds a brutal mirror to society, forcing us to question, what happens when human lives become disposable? The tragedy of Brothers Home is a painful reminder that justice often fails the vulnerable. We must never stop demanding accountability. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, follow for more.